Welcome everyone to our deep dive session on wages. Wanted to thank everyone that tried joining us last week and is now here with us today. I am Karen Diaz, the project manager for the industry we want, and here to introduce you to our initiative, our wages metric, and the country data that powers it. And also here to welcome our two speakers for today, Marissa Nuncio, Director of the Garment Worker Center in the US, and Ben Vanpeperstraete, here as a member of the Citizens Committee for the Good Clothes Fair Pay campaign. We have approximately 60 minutes scheduled for our session today. I'll be starting you off with a brief reintroduction to the industry we want, then proceed with a deep dive into our wages metric, really peeling back some of those layers of the wage data that is powering the wage gap score for this cycle. I'll then be handing it over to our two presenters, Marissa and Ben, who will help us understand and really contextualize what progress is still needed to achieve living wages for garment workers in the sector. Then after those presentations, I will invite them and Danny Chicon from WageIndicator Foundation, our data partner for this metric, to join us for the Q&A and really allow all of you to ask us questions. And we are very glad that both Marissa and Ben are here to help widen our view of the smart mix of instruments that this sector needs to pave the way for brands to also take accountability for workers' wages. Because we've all heard that wages are not paid by brands, and that is true, that is a fact. Yet we also all know that it is the pressure that is placed by brands on suppliers and orders that create the prime conditions for really low wages, wages that are not providing decent standards of living by any of the definitions that we have for living wages in production countries. However, we don't know what real wages workers are being paid out, at least not at scale. And that does slow down some of the conversations that are being had now with policymakers and those influencing policy on the changes that we need to see in legislation to change the practices of brands in market countries. That then in turn will enable the growth of garment workers' real wages in production countries. And at the industry we want, we aim to expand our work on wages. So together with our data partner, WageIndicator, but also several key stakeholders and wage experts, we are exploring how to address this gap in wage data, hoping that jointly we can determine a minimum standard for the collection of real wage data. Now, just a real quick practical reminder, please feel free to use the Q&A function in the Zoom webinar. So throughout the session, instead of putting them in the chat, my colleague will be reminding you, but yeah, please use the Q&A function so that we have an easier way of answering them at the end. So now a quick recap of the industry we want. It was initiated in 2001 by the Ethical Trading Initiative, ETI, and Fairware Foundation to accelerate progress in social, commercial, and environmental issues in the garment and footwear sector. So really looking at a holistic approach. So we were extremely pleased to be joined in our endeavors this year by the Sustainable Apparel Coalition as a lead partner and really driving forward our environmental pillar. And we've benefited hugely also from the partnership of many industry experts and just widespread consultation and input. And it really is the aim of these three organizations to support the industry we want and work together to connect the key actors across the value chain. So brands, suppliers, business associations, workers and trade unions, civil society, governments, NGO, MSIs, expert, consultant, you name them, all bringing them together to create a new normal in the garment industry. So just quickly to remind those that have already previously participated in our activities, but really more importantly, to familiarize those that are new to the industry we want, our shared vision is a garment and footwear sector that realizes its full potential to ensure dignity for workers in decent jobs, thriving businesses in the supply chain, and a positive impact on the planet. Now, around this vision statement, we have built our 3 pillars of change: social, commercial, and environmental. And within each of these pillars, we determined our key focus areas. And this was done in wide consultation with affected stakeholders and industry experts. So in the social pillar, which is the subject of our discussion today, we've got wages. In the commercial pillar, we've got purchasing practices and really how to leverage supplier feedback to drive positive developments in commercial relations. And then in the environmental pillar, our focus area is greenhouse gas emission and the reduction in line with net zero targets. So it's these focus areas in mind that we launched our first pilot iteration of the industry dashboard. You can see it here. It's 3 annual metrics, 1 on wages, 1 on purchasing practices, and 1 on greenhouse gas emissions that in 2002, this year, have established a baseline measurement for the industry. So we expect this dashboard to really act as an annual temperature check or traffic light so that we can help stimulate progress, but importantly, support alignment, encourage information exchange, collaboration, and crucially, especially with today's conversation, policy change where necessary. And the data of each of these metrics will be updated on an annual basis until 2025. Now, today's session focuses exclusively on the wage gap metric. And our wage gap score for this year is 45%, as you can see. That means that the average percentage gap between minimum wages and average living wage estimates in key garment producing countries in our data set is 45%. This tells us that on average, workers in these countries are receiving just a little over half of the money that they need for a decent standard of living. Now, this is not new information for most of us. The garment and footwear sector is really characterized by the use of cheap and disposable labor. But I think that we can all agree that if this metric needed a traffic light, it would be bright red right now. So before moving on to the next slide, I would suggest those that have phones on them to scan this QR code and follow along our live tableau so that you can see the actual figures that I will be going through in a bit from the still image that we've put in this slide deck. So just to conclude on the importance of this work and recognizing that we cannot take another 20 years to make more progress or incremental progress, because these are real lives, these are real workers and real wage gaps that on a day-to-day deal with the realities of not having enough and little hope for change. So we really hope that, by looking at this data and spurring on more conversations and convening, we can be making these real changes moving forward in collaboration with everyone. So we can move on to the next slide so we can dig deeper into the data. So I'll kick us off by describing what the data tells us. So in the beige column, across these 21 countries. In the beige column, you will see the lowest minimum wage applicable in the garment sector. So if you would, for example, hover over Romania, you would see that the lowest applicable wage is 516 euros a month. Now, looking closer at the data, you can see from this data set that there's, of course, a significant variation in the lowest applicable wages across different countries. So in Portugal, the lowest applicable minimum wage is 700 euros. And this is really the highest, on the highest end of our data set. And then on the lower end, of the lowest applicable wage, you've got India with 80 euros a month. But the data becomes more interesting when we also bring in the turquoise bar and the information presented there. And here you can see it shows the range of the living wage estimates available for each country. And these estimates include benchmarks from the WageIndicator Foundation, the Global Living Wage Coalition, the Asia Floor Wage, the European Floor Wage, but also the Clean Clothes Campaign. Now, looking further at this overview, you will see beneath each of these countries a small donut indicator. And in this indicator, it shows us the gap between the national minimum wages and the average living wage estimate for each country. And as with the other data points, there is quite some range across the different countries, from 71% in Indonesia to -2% in Honduras. And despite this variation, we see that with some consistency, there is clear and in some instances also a very significant gap between the applicable minimum wages and even the lowest living wage estimate. And that is the bright white space between the beige columns and the turquoise bars. And just a really quick side note here. Honduras and Turkey do seem to be the exceptions of the rule. And the reason for this is that the minimum wages in both of these countries have been recently hiked up quite significantly. In Honduras, this has been part of a long-term effort to raise wages, but in Turkey, this was to keep up with the spiraling inflation. So we expect those figures for Turkey to go back to being rather a large gap, but not for Honduras. So real quickly on Honduras, it is among the major apparel exporting countries with the highest percentage of workers covered by collective bargaining agreements. And if you want more information, we can share that with you. But it is quite interesting that that of the 21 countries is the only exception of the rule. So to conclude a bit, the data will be of more value and more interesting when living wage estimates are also updated, and we'll be able to see whether or not the rises in wages have kept up with the rising costs of living. Now, these exceptions aside, I think we can agree that the gaps between the minimum wages and living wages in the garment sector are quite profound. Indeed, it is clear from at least this data set that low wages are not an aberration. They are systemic and they are part of the sector itself. So what interventions do we or can we raise or make to raise wages and to help garment workers at the very least meet their basic living costs? Now, I am glad to pivot this conversation and session to hear from those that are actually working on such interventions. We are joined here today by two experts in the field of garment sector wages, both of whom will talk to us about policy interventions to improve brand accountability for wages and ultimately improve outcomes for workers at scale. So we will start off with Marissa, the director of the Garment Workers Center, who will tell you more about the passing of SB 62 and the developments around the New York Fabric Act. Marissa has a plethora of experience in organizing workers, previously representing unions, car wash workers, day laborers, and farm workers. And then after hearing from Marissa about the policy interventions in the US context, we'll then hear from Ben Vanpeperstraete, here as the member of the Citizens Committee for the Good Clothes Fair Pay campaign. And he will tell you more about this campaign as a European citizens initiative that demands living wage legislation across the garment and footwear sector. He will also share some insights on the current policy developments in the EU for effective due diligence legislation. Ben has worked extensively on labor rights, on human rights due diligence and international trade, with a strong focus on the clothing sector. And it has included, among many, many other things, supporting global unions in their work on legally binding Bangladesh Accord. But I'm now handing it over to you, Marissa. I'm really looking forward to learning more about how we can increase brand accountability for wages through policy and legislation.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here. Glad to learn from everybody here and excited to share what we've been doing and what our response in the US, in particular in California, has been to the wage gap. And I'd like to note that for us here, when we talk about the wage gap, we're both talking about the gap between actual wages and the minimum wage, because the overwhelming majority of US garment workers are not earning the local minimum wages. In Los Angeles, we're at $15 an hour. Previous to passage of the Garment Worker Protection Act, workers were earning an average of $6.75, $7 an hour. So about 46% of a gap between actual wages and the minimum wage. When we look at a living wage, that gap is far higher, obviously. What has been our response? Our response has been to come at this with our membership from two ends of the issue, to look at it as a macro issue and a micro issue, and really look at two principal root causes of wage theft in the industry. And we did that through state legislation. So we proposed state legislation called the Garment Worker Protection Act under bill number SB 62. After a 2-year campaign led by garment workers in Los Angeles, our membership, as well as an exciting coalition of unions, community organizations, and ethical fashion businesses, we were able to pass the law last year, and it went into effect this year. So what does SB 62 do? The first thing is that it bans payment by the piece. It's very common in our industry that garment workers are not earning by the hour, but they've been earning by the piece. So 3 cents a seam, 2 cents, a hem. And at those piece rates, workers were never able to earn the minimum wage. Even as the minimum wage was rightfully rising in our state, in our cities across the country, piece rates were not. And garment workers told us, they said, we want to address this issue by taking on the principal actors. And we want to address this issue by looking at fashion brands in particular. But they also said, if we don't also attack the piece rate, we will still be exploited every day when we walk into the factory. We should not have to earn our livelihood pennies at a time. And that's really how workers described it. I earn my wages by pennies. And so they included that in their bill. The other major provision was to hold fashion brands responsible for unpaid wages, to create upstream liability so that workers, if they experience wage theft, they could bring a wage claim forward through our state labor commission. They could bring that forward against their factory owner, against intermediary manufacturers, and all the way up to the fashion brands. This was actually legislation and a policy fix that we tried to introduce, us and other allies, 20 years ago. And we thought we had done just that with a previous Garment Worker Protection Act under a bill number AB 633. It was landmark legislation. It created many really important registry requirements, record-keeping requirements, an expedited wage claim process for workers, and it intended to hold fashion brands accountable for wage theft. As happens sometimes with policy, the language ended up through the policy process ended up being just a little too vague. And fashion brands were able to evade responsibility under that law for 20 years and able to put more and more layers between themselves and factory workers to buffer themselves from liability. So this really was a clarification of what the original intent of the law was. We tried to bring the smartest cases forward and really, advocate internally. And we realized we've lost that argument. Fashion brands really figured out models to avoid liability, and we had to be explicit and very clear in the law. And so we did that. There's also other provisions in our law, one of which includes expanding authority of our labor inspectors to also be able to issue citations up the supply chain, which they've not been able to do because they were only able to issue citations at the factory level where the cash flow really doesn't exist. They would often end up with large citations with nobody able to pay. And it really thwarted their abilities and really made them pull back from conducting inspections in this industry, which really sent a message out that folks could get away with thwarting the law. Folks could get away with sweatshop wages and conditions. So it was important for us to bolster their authority as well. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about, what do we think that helped us be successful in our campaign? First and foremost, this was a worker-led campaign through a variety of focus groups and research and focus groups. We brought workers together to define what they wanted to see changed in their industry. And then when the campaign launched, they were very much at the heart and center of this campaign. At every turn of the campaign, they were their own spokespeople. They were telling their stories. We ran a very robust media campaign, especially because we ran this campaign in a pandemic when we couldn't really come together in person to show our power. And workers really utilized the media and created their own media to tell their stories and to the compelling stories of why this type of wage theft and wage gap should not exist. Workers also, when the height of the pandemic was happening, workers were making masks here. They were making medical apparel, gowns, etc. And they were getting paid 2 cents a mask, pennies at a time. And workers really lifted that up. And they said, you cannot call us essential workers in this pandemic and not elevate our labor standards. Our labor standards are just as essential as this new title that you've given us. Workers also built broad support. We reached out to students, businesses, key electeds, academics, celebrities, faith groups, community groups across the state. And it was workers bringing their story to those groups and building that broad coalition. We also allied with other industry experts and watchdog groups. There are a number of organizations who, as you know, are coming together from all different angles and strategies on this issue. And we came together in a really curated, very close kind of core coalition to share strategies. Our allies really helped amplify our message and really activated their networks to get this law passed, activated their networks to put the pressure on the electeds that we needed. Another thing that we think was absolutely key in our passage of SB 62 was we reached out to ethical fashion in California. There's a growing community of environmentally conscious fashion brands, folks that consider labor standards and are really taking active, measures to monitor their supply chain, to ensure proper wages. We, as an organization, had honestly not worked with them prior to SB 62. And we had a hypothesis that if we just reach out company by company, we could find aligned interests and we could work together on this issue. And we did that. We mapped out these companies throughout California and we reached out one by one. And what we found is those businesses absolutely supported SB 62 because they wanted a level playing field. Not only did they believe in the issue morally, and it was part of their brand and their brand value, but they said, we cannot stay afloat. We cannot change this industry from within if we're competing with the guy down the street that pays $5.85 an hour and we're trying to pay $15 an hour. And they're absolutely right. And that message we took directly to the electeds. And when our chambers of commerce and when the trade associations, who are very old guard trade associations, were saying business does not want this, no business wants this, we were able to come forward and say, actually, we have 158 ethical fashion businesses that endorse SB 62, and they're sitting here in this meeting and they're ready to tell you why. Or they're here during this public hearing, ready to give testimony to tell you why. We think that was pivotal in this campaign. And then finally, we believe wholeheartedly in building a strong, educated, agitated, empowered base of workers to lead these types of campaigns. That's it. And then I'd just like to end by telling you where we're going now. SB 62 went into effect just in January, and our work really went from a policy campaign to an educational campaign on this bill. That means we're doing mass outreach to our over 45,000 workers, garment workers in Los Angeles. We're out in the fashion district weekly. We're doing mass outreach with our labor agencies, actually collaborating together to target important spots throughout the fashion district. We're holding community forums to bring workers together. We've held employer forums to also bring employers so they know what their new obligations are, but also so that they can begin to understand how to utilize upstream liability to their favor. We have done mass outreach to employers as well. This is key. We have to get the message out, and we have to work closely with our labor enforcement agency to ensure that they're doing the same. They're taking measures, very strategic, calculated measures to ensure implementation. What we did not quite expect to happen so quickly, but we're thrilled about, is that SB 62 also inspired federal legislation, and that's called the Fabric Act. And in May 13th, we became a proud endorser of the Fabric Act, which is a federal Senate, it's a Senate bill introduced by our Senator, our New York Senator Gillibrand, and it essentially takes SB 62 almost verbatim in some areas. It takes the core provisions of the piece rate ban, upstream liability, and it would apply it across the country. And it also includes other provisions. It includes a garment registry, which doesn't exist federally. It includes a new sort of division for garment enforcement under our Federal Department of Labor. And it includes some real investment in our U.S. Garment industry through grant programs and tax incentives. We're really excited that workers' vision for transforming their industry has so quickly inspired federal legislation. And you can learn more about that new fight at fabricact.org. Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa. I would like now to invite Ben to join us. And I'll be handing it over to him again. And I'll leave you to it. Ben, are you joining us?
Yes, I'm here. I'm just struggling to put my video on.
Oh, great.
I need to host permissions. Okay, there it is. But anyway, first and foremost, thank you all for being here. Thank you very much for the host for convening us to discuss this crucial matter, because however we put it, poverty wages and exploitation wages have been sort of the hallmark of this industry for a couple of decades. And we just don't manage to fix the problem with voluntary solutions, with good commitments, even of leading brands. So in that sense, indeed, as Karen mentioned in the beginning, it's really time to make the mix smarter, and in that sense, indeed, also have legislation. And so in that sense, it's also very inspiring to see what happens on the other side of the ocean. Unfortunately, we in Europe, we are not so far as what's happening there. We are only at the beginning of a process. And so that's what I'm now trying to explain, namely the Good Clothes, Fair Pay, which is basically a campaign which asks legislation to ensure that the living wage is being paid in the garment and footwear sector. So as actually my 7-year-old son was talking about earlier this week, there's actually quite a uniform demand that a fair pay is being paid to people making our clothes. Everybody wants to see that, and the only way that we know reasonably can achieve that is to have also a legislative framework in place that do so. And so that's why that's the key demand, to have laws that actually protect this human right to fair pay. And in the EU, it doesn't really make sense to do this country by country, like what would happen if Luxembourg does that and then Denmark. So we immediately eye at the EU level. So at the EU, I'm not going to say that nothing is happening at the EU. In the EU, we already saw the proposal for corporate sustainable due diligence legislation. That's a proposal that the European Commission has made earlier this year, which would require big companies to do human rights diligence, including on living wages. So that's already on the next slide. The issue, the gap there is that only applies to big companies. And although the garment industry is characterized by a number of big companies, it's also characterized by lots and lots of small and medium-sized companies at the same time. And those would not necessarily be covered by the proposal that the Commission made earlier this year. The other law or EU directive that we see is the EU Minimum Wage Directive. That's an instrument that would harmonize or give a common approach on minimum wages across the EU being in line with living wages, but also that only would apply to EU member states. And so in that sense, it would cover, for example, clothing factories in Portugal or in Italy or in Poland, but it would not cover the manufacturing that happens in, let's say, Egypt or Cambodia or Honduras. So both laws have a bit of a focus on the garment sector and on textile sector and on wages or both political processes, but there's also significant gaps, and that's really what we want to fill. So if you could go to the next slide, what the mixture that we are proposing in this European Citizens Initiative is, on the one hand, to do human rights diligence on living wages. So that's a requirement on brands to go to their factories, identify, prevent, and mitigate. So basically to look what's happening in terms of already wages already being paid and freedom of association, and stay in those factories and help fix any problems. So low wages, wages that fall short of a living wage, or also barriers to freedom of association and collective bargaining. So that the living wage human rights due diligence is a key ingredient. We also think it's important that brands look specifically at specific circumstances. So as everybody on this webinar knows, the labor force, and especially the most precarious part of the labor force in the textile industry is predominantly women, but we also have additional risks and vulnerabilities related to migrant workers or with precarious contracts, such as short-term contracts. And also the EU has repeatedly qualified that one of its prime objectives is to tackle child labor, while paying parents a living wage is a key developmental strategy to actually combat child labor, because then kids can go to schools where they actually belong. But just the human rights due diligence isn't sufficient. Also, the additional focus on women, etc. But at the same time, we also need to look at the jugular, the belly of the beast of the buyer, so to speak. So that's why the proposal equally wants to prohibit unfair trading practices, which can cause or contribute to those wages not being paid, and at the same time promote fair purchasing practices. So it also looks really at purchasing practices that happen in buying departments and not only at human rights due diligence, which might be the tenet of a corporate responsibility department within the same company. So the alignment between respecting human rights and actually paying the actual purchasing and the payment is really expressed here. And in addition to that, we also propose increased transparency. So on the one hand, there is a right for information for consumers regarding what's happening in brands in the garment and footwear sector. That right to information is not new. We already see that in, for example, the Norwegian Supply Chain Act. And at the same time, the proposal would also require brands to disclose their supply chain. Again, this is not a new thing. This is also something that has already happened for almost a decade. Brands started disclosing more and more their supplier locations after the Rana Plaza collapse and the subsequent Bangladesh Accord, but also in response to the Transparency Pledge, which was a coalition by unions and NGOs demanding for greater transparency on a minimum set of data points. So those data points are retained and complemented with two other data points relative specifically on wages. And it really goes back to the remark made in the beginning by Karen, namely that data is really so crucial. So in that sense, requiring brands to get the data and disclose the key data is also a key ingredient of the proposal. So it's quite a comprehensive proposal on ensuring living wages get paid in the supply chains of European brands and retailers, and responsibilizing collectively European brands and retailers to do so. So that's the proposal itself. Now, as you will see in the next slide, is really the crux of getting there. So as this slide already says, the legislation will require brands and retailers who are operating in the EU to do due diligence on living wages across their supply chains. But in order to get this legislation through, we also would need to pass a formal requirement of the European Citizens Initiative, and that is to have 1 million signatures of EU citizens across the EU. There's also some specific thresholds on specific countries you need to get at, but in general, we need 1 million signatures. And I'm assuming that everybody on this webinar is already asking, okay, how do I contribute? Where do I sign? How do I add my weight to push the Commission to actually start a legislative proposal? Well, that's actually quite easy. In a couple of weeks, the signature collection will go live. So that's exactly, I think, in less than 3 weeks. And in order to remain up to speed about when this happens and other updates, I can only invite you to go and visit our website, which you can see already in the chat, and then just register to the email list. And then whenever we launch, try to be within the first 10 signatures of the Citizens Initiative up to 1 million. I'll thank you very much for your attention so far, and happy to answer any questions if any later.
I think we can all agree that progress on wages is crucial. Well, progress on all of these metrics is really important to drive the industry vision that we're looking for. But for today, I think that we can all agree that progress on wages is crucial. So we're looking forward to supporting this as the industry we want. looking to drive towards industry transformation, be a resource, a convener, an ally for change. So hopefully we get to work with many of you and collaborate on improving the data behind these metrics, but more importantly, on improving the results and the impact on the ground. So that's all for today. We've run out of time, but in the meantime, please feel free to reach out and join us on LinkedIn, Twitter. You can also just go to our inbox. And it was a pleasure to host this session, and I'm happy that we didn't experience any further difficulties. So wishing you a great afternoon or morning wherever you are. And goodbye. Thanks, everyone.